I think you do have to flesh this out because when Kennedy died, it changed everything. It changed the course of the 1964 presidential election. It changed the course of legislation in 1964. And it definitely had an impact on the GOP primaries. From the studios today, we want to play out an historical what if, specifically with regards to the 1964 presidential election. The question is this: would John F. Kennedy have been reelected in 1964 if he had lived? So let's start out just by saying the following. None of us will ever conclusively know the answer to this question. And anybody out there who tells you that they know for sure what would have happened in the 1964 presidential election if Kennedy had lived, they are not telling you the truth because it didn't happen. So none of us can ever truly know the answer to this. But what we can do is we can make inferences based off of history, inferences based off of what we know to have happened, and try to piece it together as best we can, with the caveat, again, that none of us will ever truly know. So in a historical look back, what if scenario like this, where we can start is with what did actually happen in the 1964 presidential election. And we know that Lyndon Johnson, who was the incumbent president at the time after John F. Kennedy's passing, he did win the presidential election in 1964 by a landslide. So, of course, Lyndon Johnson elevated to the presidency in November 1963 after Kennedy's death in Texas, and it was a landslide for LBJ. Johnson, 43.1 million votes, versus Barry Goldwater, the Republican, about 27.2 million votes. The popular vote was a rout, 61 to 38%. You just don't see elections like this anymore. There would be another one that was similar in 1972, and I guess you could say another one that was even similar to that in 1984, but popular votes that are hugely slanted like this, not in this polarized country, not anymore. And then you take a look at the Electoral College, and it was quite the blowout. Lyndon Johnson getting 486 electoral votes. Barry Goldwater, the Republican, just 52. So he carried the South after the passage of the civil rights legislation, and he carried his home state of Arizona, and that's about it. But also to show you, because, certain parts of a state may support one candidate or another. So we decided to also show this by the number of congressional districts won. And again, that was a pretty sizable blowout. LBJ carried 375 of them. Barry Goldwater only won 60. So any way you slice it, LBJ won this thing in a landslide. So Lyndon Johnson, he was the president for about a year when the 1964 presidential election took place. He had supported JFK's Civil Rights Act. He helped get it passed through Congress in 1964. So the Civil Rights Act, that was a piece of hallmark legislation that John F. Kennedy, while he was president, wanted to get passed. But it wasn't going anywhere. And at the time of Kennedy's passing, it was being held up in Congress. But then LBJ became president. He was a former member of Congress. He knew how to play Congress very well. He used a combination of Kennedy's passing and the groundswell of support that came from it, in addition to his ability to get things done with Congress, knowing how Congress works, that old bully pulpit. The combination of those two things, he helped get it passed. Now, if Kennedy had lived, I don't know that it passes. But LBJ was able to use the situation to his advantage to get the legislation through Congress. Now, we also know that his Republican opponent, Barry Goldwater, the senator from Arizona, he opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So Goldwater claimed that he opposed it on constitutional grounds. And of course, Barry Goldwater, as people would know back then, was considered a staunch conservative. Those who are familiar with American history from the time would know his famous quote, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice." And the rest of that quote is, "Moderation in pursuit of justice is no virtue. So he put down his marker. He was a conservative. He wasn't going to cave into the moderates. And there were quite a few of them in the Republican Party, and they didn't like him. And some of them just didn't endorse him. So there were movers and shakers in the GOP in 1964 that just did not get behind Barry Goldwater because they thought he was too conservative. And on the bigger picture, outside of the Republican Party, his candidacy really just did not attract widespread support because he was seen as catering just to the right and didn't have that kind of broad appeal that you would need to win an election back in 1964. And what we also knew, well, we say 1964 on the screen, but this is more like 1963. At the time of his passing, John F. Kennedy, according to the Gallup poll, had a 58% approval rating. His approval rating was generally high. It had gone lower over the course of his term. 58% was pretty close to the bottom of where his approval rating landed. It never went below 50% at any point during his term and was at many points higher than 58%. So you could infer that he was a relatively popular president at the time of his death. So that is what we know about this. So now the first question is, John F. Kennedy alive, Democratic nominee. You got that locked in stone. Okay, that's number one. Number two, would Barry Goldwater still have been the Republican nominee? Because I think you do have to flesh this out. Because when Kennedy died, it changed everything. It changed the course of the 1964 presidential election. It changed the course of legislation in 1964. And it definitely had an impact on the GOP primaries, which started in 1963. The presidential campaign started in 1963 and went into 1964. Definitely had an impact on all of those things. So you had Barry Goldwater in there, the Arizona senator. He ended up winning. You also had Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York. He was a leading candidate. He was definitely more moderate, could even say more liberal of a Republican. So he had temporarily suspended his campaign in late 1963 after all of this happened in Dallas, Texas. He had only just gotten into the race before that, but he was already starting to fall behind Goldwater. Actually, his high water mark in the polling that you can see out there, it was actually from well before he got into the race, while Kennedy was still alive. So you could say that Rockefeller's candidacy probably peaked before he was even actually technically running. Then you also had somebody like Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. He was being drafted for the presidency. He did not want to run. Had he run, he might have done decently well, but you can't nominate somebody who doesn't want the job. And then you also had Richard Nixon, who at the time was the former vice president. He was mentioned. He did not run. Obviously, he would run 4 years later. And then you had the governor of Pennsylvania, Bill Scranton. He was kind of a late entry into the mix, but it was, I guess, too little too late, and that didn't go anywhere. So at the end of the day, you add all that up, the Republican nominee probably was still going to be Barry Goldwater, I think. Not everybody in the Republican Party loved him, like we said. But in late 1963, when all that happened with Kennedy, he was essentially the front runner at that point. And he ended up winning the nomination. So it would have been one thing if, like, for example, Nelson Rockefeller was way ahead and then the priorities of the GOP completely changed after Kennedy, and then this happened. But no, Goldwater was seen to be ahead. He had competition for it, but he was believed to be ahead, and he ended up winning the nomination. So I suppose that he still would have been the nominee. So then the question is the general election. JFK versus Goldwater, 1964. I think, in my opinion, based on what we know, I think Kennedy would have won. I can't see a world in which Barry Goldwater would have beaten John F. Kennedy in a presidential election. I mean, it's possible it could have been closer than what LBJ ended up getting, which was almost 500 electoral votes in an electoral landslide. It probably would have been closer than that. What states would have flipped? I don't know, but it probably would have been closer than that. But I just cannot envision. There's nothing in my brain that can help me envision Barry Goldwater getting 270 electoral votes against John F. Kennedy. I can't picture it. Maybe it would have happened because, like I said, none of us will ever know the answer to that question. But theoretically possible, but very, very unlikely. And especially when you consider the fact that there were a lot of Republicans that just were not interested in supporting his candidacy. A lot of the moderates and liberal Republicans just wanted to have nothing to do with Goldwater. So some of those people might have stayed home. Some of them might have ended up voting for Kennedy. Now, also, as we've already established, civil rights very well might not have passed had Kennedy lived. So maybe the map would have looked different. Maybe the South would have voted blue. Maybe some other states would have voted red instead. We don't know. But, it's entirely possible the map would have had some differences to it. But at the end of the day, you got to think that Kennedy would have been the favorite, especially if he were running against Goldwater, because you'd have all these moderate and liberal Republicans. And there were quite a few, especially on the national stage, that just were not interested in supporting Barry Goldwater. So where do those people go? Even if they don't vote, they wouldn't be voting for Goldwater. So you would think that Kennedy would have had the upper hand in 1964. And had he lived, he probably would have been president until 1969. And then, is it still Richard Nixon? I mean, it's really interesting to play these what-if games because one presidential election really can just change the course of history. So yeah, let's say Kennedy does win in 1964. Does Nixon win in 1968? Who else runs in 1968? It's really hard to say. Well, it might not have been Hubert Humphrey as the nominee because he wouldn't have been vice president. So a lot of things would have been different. Who is to say? But this is just one example of an historical what if